It's a great pleasure to be here today and to speak at this event. As my role is national, I'm often found on trains travelling around the country, so it's even more of a pleasure to be here in my hometown. And in this beautiful theatre, which holds so many memories for me. In fact, I think this is the first theatre where I independently chose to go to the theatre on my own and wasn't taken as part of a family group. And if I remember rightly, it was to see Sheridan's The School for Scandal. And my friends and I felt terribly sophisticated coming out on our own for an evening at the theatre. And I think that's relevant because it's that moment or that choice that people make where they independently choose to go to the theatre or to see theatre that I want to talk about today, and I'll come back to that. So what I do want to talk about is about how the arts and cultural organisations that I've been working with have been changing their offer to make themselves and their work matter more to more people. So it was in this city that I went to university and got my first proper job about 20 years ago, which was working for theatre and dance organisations, managing their outreach programmes and trying to reach out and engage people that wouldn't really say that the arts was for them, and getting them to come in and see our shows and to participate in workshops and activities that we were offering. The conundrum of how to engage somebody that doesn't ordinarily engage in arts and theatre is something that has always fascinated me and still drives me to this day, and something I spent my entire career looking into. So I'm sure you're all familiar with that really special moment that happens when you see somebody or you're with them that sees theatre for the first time or participates in a workshop or makes or creates a piece of artwork. And it can be really transformational, both for that person but also for everybody else involved. And it's that kind of special moment and that kind of impact that it has on the person that I find really inspiring. Okay, so a little bit about the Arts Council. It's the national development agency in England for the arts, and we receive money from the government and from something called the National Lottery, which I think many of you have as well. And we advocate the importance of arts and culture to the government and to the general public. We fund arts and cultural activity and organisations, and we do this largely through something called our National Portfolio of Organisations, or NPOs for short, of which Sheffield Theatres is one. And we also have things that we call strategic funding programmes, which are really there to fill gaps in arts provision, and I'll come on to talk a little bit about some of those. So in my role at Arts Council, I'm lucky enough to work on designing funding programmes that create more opportunities for people to access the arts and culture. And I'd like to tell you a little bit more about some of these and what people have been doing to make culture matter to more people. But before I do, I just want to tell you a little bit about who the arts audiences are in England. So we know that aside from any other factors, the following have a moderate to a large impact on engagement with the arts at a national level. So education, being educated to a degree level, makes you more likely than those who haven't to engage in the arts. Your socio-economic background, in that those people who are more actively involved with arts and culture tend to be from the most privileged parts of society. Your age, especially when you get to the age of 75, people's engagement with arts and culture, even if they've been very passionately engaged up until that point, starts to tail off, and you're less likely to engage in the arts. And your ethnicity. This isn't as large a factor as the other three previous things I've talked about, but people from a white background are more likely to engage than people from minority and ethnic backgrounds. Okay, so who are arts audiences reaching? Just generally, in terms of arts audiences, there are broadly 3 types. Those that are highly engaged, and that means that they go to arts theatre events more than 3 times a year. Those who kind of moderately engage in the arts, they might go once or twice a year. And those that don't engage or haven't for some time. And you can see from the data breakdown that in England, 22% are from the high engaged, 41% belong to the medium engaged, and 36% of people belong to the groups that don't attend arts events or haven't for some time. So let's have a look in a little bit more detail about theatre. And we can see from something called the Taking Part Survey, which is a major continuous survey of culture and sports participation habits in England. And every year it collects detailed information from adults over the age of 16 about their attendance in a wide variety of events. And that's arts, sports, galleries, museums, libraries, heritage sites. So the survey has been going since 2005, so it's quite a rich data set now. And when looking at theatre, we can see that around 4 in 10 adults, which is about 38%, had engaged in theatre in 2015-16, and a similar amount engaged in 2008-9. So it's relatively, there's a little dip there, but it's relatively static, the amount of people who are engaging. So I'm just going to get quite data geekery now. So for those of you who like numbers, you'll like this bit, but for those of you who don't, stick with me and I'll try and make it as friendly as possible. So when looking at 2 years and comparing them, and we've got years 2010-11, which is the kind of mustardy colour, and then we've got 2015 and 16, which is black. You can see that women are always more likely to engage than men. Looking at age, those who are over 75, you can see that drop-off rate reflected there in the taking part data. They're less likely to engage in theatre, and this is all just theatre. Those with a life-limiting illness or a disability, again, they're less likely to engage than those without. And ethnicity, in theatre, this is more of an issue than in some other art forms, but those from ethnic backgrounds are less likely to engage than those from a white background. Socioeconomic group, reflecting the general population, those from the higher socioeconomic groups are far more likely to engage in theatre than those who aren't. When kind of looking at this a little bit further, we can also see that you've got all the different art forms there, but in theatre, 44% of people who attend are from, this is just ticketed events, are from the high engaged groups, 41% are from the medium, and 14% are from the low engaged. So thinking back to the general population, there's a propensity there for more people from the lower socio-economic groups to be engaging in theatre because they are engaging in other art forms. Interestingly, between 2010-11 and 2015-16, there was a decrease in theatre engagement from adults among the upper socio-economic groups. So that's the numbers bit for a while. So one of the projects that I work on, as I've said, the Arts Council uses strategic funding to address gaps in places where we think our general funding and our national portfolio organisations aren't reaching. And one of these, which I work on, is called Creative People and Places. And this works in areas which, according to another survey called the Active People Survey, we like our surveys in England, falls into areas in England where people's engagement in the arts is in the lowest 20%. Interestingly, as I've mentioned, I've been working very closely with Kulturrådet in Sweden to look at how they have helped them, how they can set up this programme in Sweden, which they have done, and have recently awarded their first cohort of projects. And they're also coming back over to England, I think it's in May, June time, with all the other Nordic arts councils who are also interested in implementing similar programmes in those countries. So the reason we did this was when we looked at where our national portfolio organisations were based, and the yellow dots are theatres, you can see that naturally, of course, there are clusters around urban conurbations. And this also, inadvertently, causes inequality between the funded arts offer that somebody receives according to where they live. When we then looked at, so the national portfolio organisations are the dots in red, at the places in England where there's really low arts engagement, which are the shaded places, you can see that there's clear gaps where there's often a shaded place and there's no red dots. So we decided that in order to address this, we needed to put funding into these places which weren't accessing Arts Council funding through the national portfolio provision. And this was called Creative People and Places, and so this is where these places are, and there's 21 of them across the country. And since 2012, the Arts Council's invested 57 million in those 21 places. So it's quite a big programme. And it's significantly different to any of our other programmes. It's led by consortia who have not traditionally been funded by the Arts Council before. So we funded people to lead those consortia like rugby clubs, housing associations, community trusts. And as I've said, historically, these places have received very low investment. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about the types of approaches that they're using. It's part of the programme and a criteria that all of these places have to include a strong community voice within them. So going back to Ivor's story, and that communities are consulted as part of projects as commissioners, decision makers, co-producers and volunteers. And this ensures that the art that is created is very relevant to those communities. So I'm just going to tell you about a few of them. One called Bait is up in southeast Northumberland in the north of England. And this project was with Unfolding Theatre, and it was called The Frost of Forgetfulness. Now, Bait takes very careful, considered approaches to working with artists and theatre makers, and they spend an awful lot of time developing that work with those local communities that tells people's stories and is relevant to them and really reflects the sense of place. So one of these projects, as I've said, was The Frost of Forgetfulness, and the kind of finale was at Woodhorn Museum, and it was commissioned by a community panel. So they interviewed and selected an artist from a number of different organisations, and the artist Annie Rigby from Unfolding Theatre secured this project. It involved young people from a place called Bedlington who were on the panel, the commissioning panel, and they were also volunteers at the event. Children from the local Brownian Scout groups, as part of the Scouts movement, as consultants, and adults from the Recovery Partnership, so that was drug and alcohol misuse, in the local area, to create the final installation. So over 7 days, over 3,000 local people took part in the finished event, and many of them were in family groups. So Annie took a very inherently collaborative approach to her work. She had previously worked with communities in this area, and it's often that commitment from artists to understand a place and its people and create local ownership of the work that makes the art they create matter to more people. Another of the projects, Transported, they had a project. They are in a very rural area of Lincolnshire, which isn't too far from here, and they commissioned new theatre pieces that really reflected their location. in order to make them accessible and relevant to local audiences that wouldn't normally go to theatre. They were presented locally in the street, often on the back of lorries, because transport is a massive issue. And the first piece that they did was called Fenboy, and that was very visual theatre because they have a lot of communities where English isn't their first language, so it was to appeal to that. They, interestingly, Transported has great partnerships with the local businesses. So they work with a haulage company called Freshlink who provided the lorries for them to tour on. And they also have another project with Freshlink called Art on Lorries, where they kind of wrap the lorries in artwork by contemporary visual artists. And Freshlink have found that this has got really good, their business has got really good staff retention from this. So staff are kind of working with them for longer. Lorry drivers are fighting over which lorries they want to drive, and Freshlink are reinvesting in the arts in that area. So that's a great example of how working with local businesses can help different approaches to engaging new audiences. The next slide I want to tell you about is by a project called Made in Corby. And they worked with an organisation called Frantic Assembly. The artistic director, Scott Graham, is from Corby, and I'm going to show you a short film, which is why I'm pausing for a click, about why he wanted to get involved in working back in Corby and the Corby project. So from that project, 36% of the bookers to that show were first-time attenders to an event at the Corby Cube, the theatre that you saw there, or to the Royal and Derngate Theatre in Northampton, where it was also performed. And they did exit surveys, and from that, 21% had not attended an arts event in the past 12 months. 5% had a disability, 20% were young people, and 15% were over 65. Another quite different project was up in a place called East Durham, back up in the north of England, and they worked with their local arts centre, which is kind of a multi-art centre, does performing arts, visual arts, all kinds of things. But they began working with them in 2015 on a project across community centres in East Durham. And they used the Art Centre's expertise in selecting and presenting high-quality theatre to work with local venues, because in this area, I mean, I've been up a few times and it's absolutely no infrastructure there at all. It's just houses upon houses upon houses. And so the community spaces that they could find, they were working with the Arts Centre to help local people to be able to programme and select theatre to programme in those spaces. And the project was trying to target audiences from the low and the medium engaged segments. And they also wanted to introduce artists to working in this area and companies to thinking about working in this area in the future, and develop a strong relationship between the Arts Centre and the project in this area. So it was successful. It delivered over 40 performances of high quality theatre. It attracted over 1,000 people, which, considering that this is it's a really tough area to work in, was a success. It brought high quality theatre to 6 different towns, and as I've just said, many of these are in the lowest 10% in terms of multiple deprivation indices, so they're really difficult areas to work in. And as a result, each community space now has a tech spec for their space, so they know what they can and can't take in, obviously. And they have letters of agreement for artist companies to sign and partnership agreements. And they have learned all about marketing, promotion, ticketing, and that sort of thing. So they're kind of set up to do this on their own. There is also a consensus that the Cultural Hubs programme has helped change audiences' views about art. to the extent that the managers of each of these hubs felt that now the original sets of survey questions are far too simplistic for their audience members. An interesting one, and my final example, is from the New Vic Theatre, which is in Stoke-on-Trent. And they were actually a lead organisation, so they led one of these consortia projects. And it's interesting to look at the impact it's had on the theatre, kind of managing one of these programmes. They've really found it as a source of inspiration, and it's inspired individuals within the theatre, especially the artistic director, in terms of what theatre can achieve for the communities, but also in terms of their own artistic ambitions. It has enabled the local authority in that area to become much bolder and much more confident about talking about culture, so much so that they're applying to be a city of culture in the UK. And it has also led to the New Vic building and forming new production partnerships with different companies, also with local people, new community groups, and developing new strategic partnerships within their city. It has also impacted on the way that this theatre collects its audience data, and they have integrated some of the approaches within how they speak to and communicate with audiences. They've started doing things like photo booth style feedbacks after performances, and they also run something called supper clubs, where they invite audiences to come together and to discuss the show, and they talk about things like ticket prices and all kinds of stuff. Which really offers great insight into what audiences think, not only about the show, but about the venue and all of the facilities. It engages infrequent and low attenders, and it builds on the strategic work that the project has done. And it started to convert audiences that the project is reaching into audiences for the theatre. So far they've converted 11% of the project, which is called Appetite, of their audiences into audiences that go to the New Vic Theatre. They have tried different ways of doing that, and ticket pricing, which I know you're going to discuss shortly, is one of them. They are also going to develop an ambassador scheme that allows for peer-to-peer promotion, which also includes digital ambassadors and working with members of the local community that are great at tweeting and on social media, and have a strong influential presence. They've also found that it supports the development in-house of producers and managers who've been able to develop different skills of working with communities, as well as their own technical skills and the traditional skills of working in a theatre. And it has also, they found that it has supported emerging artists and theatre makers to progress, and some of whom have become quite unexpected leaders. So we know from all of our data that Creative People and Places is working. So far we've had over 1.5 million engagements with the programme. 90% of the people that the programme is reaching are not from the high engaged group, they're from the medium or the low engaged groups. It involves the public as key partners and decision makers, and that's absolutely crucial. And it also, for the Arts Council, our goals are around things like engagement and excellence, and we're really finding that it's impacting on our goals around excellence. And some of the work being produced is really innovative, strong, different theatre and arts events. And a couple of these projects have access to funds that we have called Ambitions for Excellence. So it's really pushing innovation in the arts forwards. We also asked places to have a 10-year vision for their projects, and we found that this is absolutely vital, as this work is time-consuming, it does take time, and people need to remember that. And as always with everything, there are constant challenges around sustainability and fundraising, but there have been some quite innovative ways of looking at that as well. So we can see from the data, as I said, that it's reaching people from the low and medium engaged groups. And this, just go on to the next one. This is theatre. And you can see that in 2015, there were over 208 theatre events, and there was an over-index in the medium-engaged audiences and 2 segments of the low-engaged audiences. So the audience profile for these projects, if I just go back, that's kind of these projects generally, and for theatre within them, is very, very different from the traditional arts-going audiences.
When you say over-index, could you...
Sorry, I'm just meaning that if we go back to that first slide with kind of the general population, we wouldn't expect to see, so Facebook families, in this one here, they don't attend the arts that much, so these are all quite low engagers generally, but we can see here that 21% of people from this segment were engaging, which is really high for this group. So yeah, sorry. So the creative people and places audiences, that's just to illustrate it really in a data form, in that it is very different, as I've said, from the normal traditional arts audience. And that isn't to say that a lot of traditional theatres, our MPO portfolios aren't changing the way that they approach engaging with their communities. There are some really good examples. I'm sure there are many here today, and also in England we have theatre in London called the Albany, which does some fantastic work with a company called Entelecare around older people, and they turn their theatre into a day centre and have a contract with the local authority about engaging older people. Locally, there's the West Yorkshire Playhouse, who runs a group called Heydays. Again, that's for older people. And if Dan hasn't already, I'll let him tell you about the Sheffield People's Theatre and some of the work that's happened here. I saw a few clips on those slides. So we commissioned an organisation to look in a bit more detail about the creative people and places and their audiences. And what we found was that it wasn't about kind of the who, the what, the where, the when, what time a performance was on, the cost of it really, or the venue. It was about how that offer was made to local people. And to have the evidence to support this is massively significant. So in order to make theatre in these places matter more to more people, they never assume what the communities want. They always ask them and take time to find out. A key difference to the way in which they work is a shift in power from the director to local communities. And this the local community representative, and whether it's a participant, an audience member, an advisor or a decision maker or a commissioner, local people are always involved every step of the way. So the power of artistic decisions is very much handed over to them, guided obviously by the artistic director, but it is a very different way of working. And it also has an impact on leadership. And we're finding that creative people and places is creating a new type of leader, which is very different from some of the traditional leadership programs that we run in England. So I'll leave that thought with you, and thank you very much.